Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. How are you? Have a nice weekend, everyone, and God bless you. Alright, now we will come to today's news. John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania. There's a person who suffered a massive stroke last year, right before the senatorial primaries in the Democratic Party. He could have stepped out. His wife could have encouraged him to step out. The Democratic Party could have encouraged him to step out. They did not. He ended up becoming the nominee. And then he ended up becoming the senator from Pennsylvania, in large part because the Republicans decided to run for governor, a really bad candidate, against Josh Shapiro, and Josh Shapiro basically dragged Fetterman across the finish line. But you will recall that the narrative about Fetterman throughout the race is that everybody was playing up his health problems. It was a lie. John Fetterman has a very, very serious health problem. He had suffered an incredibly serious stroke. It had affected his function. And it affected his brain. He could not process language that he was hearing. He could not speak properly. He could not understand things. And we're told that we're supposed to ignore all of this, to play any of this aptitude, to even notice any of this was a form of ableism. And his wife, she's all Fetterman, who seems like one of the grosser people in American politics, having essentially pushed her husband into continuing his run despite his extraordinarily serious health ailment. She kept saying, "Why don't you just leave him alone? He's totally fine. He's totally fine." Okay, so then there's a major debate, you'll recall, between Mehmet Oz, the Republican, Pennsylvania senatorial candidate, and John Fetterman, in which Fetterman clearly cannot speak, in which Fetterman is botching his sentences, in which Fetterman cannot get through a full paragraph without stumbling all over himself again, not through any fault of his own, putting aside his politics, just because he has a serious brain issue. And we were told him that to notice was a form of ableism. And don't worry, guys, he would get better. It was very important to recognize how much better he would get. In fact, Scientific American ran an entire piece on October 21, 2022, titled "John Fetterman Shows How Well the Brain Recovers After Stroke." Following a stroke, the brain's own repair processes can lead to a strong recovery in people such as Senate candidate John Fetterman. He talked about how he sat down for an interview with NBC News, where he had used closed captioning technology to help manage the auditory processing issues caused by the stroke. And Scientific American was very, very critical of a reporter for NBC News named Asha Burns, because Dasha Burns suggested that he actually was not fit as a fiddle, that he had some very serious brain issues, and people like Kara Swisher over the New York Times, one of the worst reporters in America, Kara Swisher immediately jumped on Zatia Burns and said, "How dare you point out that John Fetterman is having problems processing auditory information? In that again, that's ableism. To even notice this is ableism." And Scientific American defending John Fetterman's health status, saying aphasia, or the inability to understand or express speech, is very common following a stroke, impacting an estimated 30 people who have one, but the brain can modify and adapt to this new injury, a process known as neuroplasticity. Again, the idea here was that John Fetterman would be just fine. Who would be just fine? Well, we know that last week, John Fetterman ended up in the hospital for several days, ended up in the hospital for unspecified reasons. It was unclear whether he'd had another stroke. There were some scans done. It turned out that, thank God, he did not have another stroke. Well, now he has checked himself into the hospital for clinical depression again, and it has become perfectly obvious, or should be obvious to anyone with a brain at this point. Anybody with a functioning heart at this point? Anybody who has any level of empathy at all this point? John Fetterman should not have been running for the Senate. Now, that doesn't mean that the Democrats would have lost the seat. They probably would not have lost the seat. There were other candidates available before the primary. They could theoretically have John Fetterman today step down and resign. What's amazing, however, is how quickly, even during the Senate race, there was talk about his wife, Giselle Fetterman, replacing John Fetterman in the Senate. And so the going wisdom was that if John Fetterman were to step down, his wife would replace him, which would immediately make her one of the worst people in American public life, if she's not already, because then it would be like, okay, I ran a person I knew I had a serious physical handicap and mental handicap. I ran a person I'm supposed to love. This was my highest priority for the Senate. And now I'm gonna take a seat. I mean, just be extraordinary. It'd be extraordinary. And Giselle is an openly political figure, it would not be out of the realm of possibility. And again, many people in the Democratic Party are suggesting exactly this. So yesterday, John Fetterman checked himself into the Walter Reed Hospital to seek treatment for clinical depression. The announcement came from a statement released on Thursday by Veterans Chief of Staff Adam Gentle. Senate said last night Senator John Fetterman checked himself into Walter Reed National Military Medical Center to receive treatment for clinical depression. While John has experienced depression on and off throughout his life, it only became severe in recent weeks. Well, I mean, what could have happened in recent weeks? What could have happened in recent weeks that would have maybe added to John Fetterman's stress? Could it be the fact that it is now February and John Fetterman officially became a senator about 5 weeks ago? Maybe that would be the issue here. The statement added that the senator had been evaluated on Monday by the attending physician of the Congress Brian Warren Monahan, and he had recommended inpatient care at Walter Reed. Now again, inpatient care for depression is very different from outpatient care for depression. Outpatient care just means you went to the hospital and then they looked at you and then you left, or being under a psychiatrist care as millions of Americans are for depression means that you go about your daily life and then you meet with your psychiatrist. Sometimes you need medication, sometimes you don't. Being in inpatient care at a hospital for depression is a very serious business. After examining John, the doctors, Walter Reed told us John is getting the care he needs and will soon be back to himself. Okay. We keep hearing that he will be back to himself. But what is the standard for back to himself? Clearly not his pre-stroke self. Clearly. Earlier this month, Fetterman was hospitalized. After feeling lightheaded, test ruled out another stroke or cardiac event. Giselle, his wife, tweeted gentleman's statement along with her own comments voicing her support for her husband. Now again, what have been the best way to achieve privacy for your family is for him not to have been running in a senatorial election with a serious brain problem. Giselle asking for privacy on the basis of his health problems. That again, you guys were hiding for months, you didn't let him do interviews. You didn't explain what was going on with his brain, you lied to the Pennsylvania people. And then when the whys ended, you then implied that anybody who was pointing this out was an ableist. She wrote, after what he's been through in the past year, there's probably no one who wanted to talk about his own health less than John. I'm so proud of him for asking for help and getting the care he needs. This is a difficult time for our family. So please respect our privacy. For us, the kids come first. Take care of yourselves. Hold your loved ones close. You are not alone. For yourself, the kids come from. I have serious questions about her as a human being, I really do. And this is not to call it anybody who has a spouse who has depression. People should get the care that they need. There's nothing wrong with trying to determine getting the care that he needs. There's something very wrong with a spouse of a person who has a serious brain problem running that person in his senatorial election from the person is not well, and then making the most of the situation politically. And then when the mental health problems continue, when the brain problems continue, then it's it's all about the privacy, and we wish we had our privacy. That it's really again, there's only one reason that John Fetterman is in the public eye right now. And it's because the Democratic Party and the compliant media and his immediate family all decided together that it was more important that John Fetterman take that Pennsylvania Senate seat than that he actually be given time to recover from a serious brain injury. Because again, he is not a well person. That is not a rip on him. That is a reality. Despite the media's attempts to paint John Fetterman as though he is totally fine. So even the New York Times is pointing out that the additional stresses have made things worse for John Fetterman. It is not just a question of he was in a stable position. He was never in stable position. And this does fall on family to protect people who are not in a stable position. Can you imagine doing this to your spouse? Can you? According to the New York Times, Senator John Fetterman, Democratic Pennsylvania, who was hospitalized last week after feeling lightheaded, checked himself into Walter Reed National Military Medical Center on Wednesday night to receive treatment for clinical depression, according to his office. His decision to do this could place Fetterman at the center of a national conversation about mental health struggles that have become more public and urgent since the pandemic began. So the New York Times is trying to transition this conversation away from the specifics of a spouse, essentially pushing her husband into continuing a senatorial run into a broader conversation about mental health. We should all have a conversation about mental health and wellness and getting the treatment that you need, and maybe what societal standards are propagating depression and mental illness. We talked about this earlier this week, because obviously, we've seen a massive uptick in the United States in mental unwellness, particularly among young people and teen girls, particularly, but that is not what this conversation is about. This conversation is about why there's a person who had a serious stroke who was maintained in the race pushed for by the left-wing press pushed for by his wife, and now is seeing the effects of that on his brain. And next news, what a ridiculous response. Once again, let's go right back to the chart. The fight isn't here. The fight theoretically is in Asia, the entire continent of Asia is trending upwards. They're polluting more and more every single year. There's no pledge to sustainability. There's no climate pledge, it's actual profits. Above all, air quality, drinking water, oceans, carbon emissions. Be damned if we have to sit here and listen to these insufferable leftist twats lecture us that we're the problem and that the blame shouldn't be shifted elsewhere. No, you're a nutcase. Please get away from me. And what's even more laughable is their proposed solution. It always seems to be the same damn thing: bigger government, higher taxes. That's how you solve the problem. Completely ridiculous. You know, there's certain places where it's appropriate where government can act. I know libertarians that are listening are probably getting triggered right now. Because their ideal world is no government and literally zero tax. There's some social programs that make sense, services that target very specific people. You know, for instance, with Jon Stewart was fighting for getting better healthcare services, targeting 911 survivors, or fixing the VA, for instance, getting better health and mental health care for military veterans. There's certain things that make sense, better services for those at the absolute bottom of the economic spectrum. Sure, it makes sense universal health care, ridiculous with very specific targeted programs that makes sense within the scope of the budget that the country can actually afford. That's fiscally responsible. That makes sense, even infrastructure spending, and some environmental protection spending. In many cases, it makes sense. But the problem is the government has become so bloated, so corrupt, and a point that Josh Hawley made is going to help me get to the point that I'm trying to get to instead. This administration, Democrats and even Republicans would rather spend over $100 billion fighting a proxy war in Ukraine than do anything actually productive. You want to talk about the climate crisis being the war that we should be fighting as your Democrat president continues to fund the military-industrial complex as wet dream in Ukraine continues to spend taxpayer dollars like a financially illiterate superstar athlete with a cocaine problem. You want to target Josh Hawley and Republicans is the problem when the reason we can't have nice things is because Democrats don't know how to frickin' spend money well. Instantly, you lost me, and that tends to be the case when it comes to discussions or negotiating with leftover leads. You tend to lose me because you're living in a fantasy land. I prefer to live in the real world rather than your alternate reality. And that's why we just can't be friends. Ladies and gentlemen, give me your thoughts below. And hit subscribe right now. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you for watching the video.